I'd like to introduce Andy Johnson, Executive Coach to Quiet Leaders, an organizational consultant at Price Associates. Andy is certified as a behavioral motivators, acumen capacity, and emotional intelligence analyst through TTI Success Insights. Andy was also a speaker at this year's international conference, which we held back in January. His session earned a 100% satisfaction rating, which has been repurposed and will be presented here today. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Andy.
Great. Thank you, Candace. Do I click show my screen?
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Okay. Thanks. You know how introverts are. We're a little bit awkward. Just kidding. Well, it's super to be with you all today. First, want to say thank you to Candace and Cafe and TTI for being such a gracious host and really giving a platform for what I think this is really bigger than just a webinar. I think as you'll see in our time together, it's really kind of a social or a cultural movement. At least that's the way that I see it. So getting going this morning, let me just begin by introducing you a little bit to me and putting this whole discussion in context. So the guy on the screen is not me. I think some of you may have seen my photo, but he really represents this confused look that I think I had at a key point in my life. I was originally an architect. That's what I did first in my professional life. And I had worked successfully in lots of different firms and eventually started my own and grew that firm to a pretty successful size, so much so that I actually ended up selling that firm and moving more intentionally into working with people, which is really the focus of my life at this point and has been for a number of years. But I've led in lots of different capacities. And so in one of my experiences about 8 or 9 years ago, the organization that I was one of the leaders in had an executive coach. And long story short, he gave me an assessment that I had never taken before called the DISC. And so I got my DISC results. And I was a little bit surprised, quite frankly, to see what it looked like. So for those that know the DISC, this is what it looked like. Some of you on the call may not know the DISC assessment. The quick intro to it, the S and the C dimensions are both kind of two sides of introversion. So I talked with my coach, Ron Price, at the time and said, there's something wrong, as he's beginning to unpack the assessment, and said, this can't be right. I'm certainly not one of those dreaded introverts. I know I'm an extrovert. My family of origin was very much about extroversion. And so again, I slowly but surely began to accept and embrace my identity as an introvert myself, and really ran into this interesting idea in our culture about how introversion and leadership either disconnect or connect, depending on how you see it. So that's really the kind of the context for this conversation today. It really starts with me being a bit confused about myself and beginning little by little to own this part of me. So here's a depiction, again, for those that aren't familiar with the DISC assessment, no worries, it's pretty easy here. So you can see this is a depiction of kind of the way the world, I think, perhaps ought to be around these individual traits that we sometimes call introversion and extroversion. So in this depiction, you can see there's two sides to extroversion on the left and two sides to introversion on the right. And really a nice balance between both people and task orientation on both sides of the teeter-totter, if you will. So all is well, all is balanced, and this is a great picture of perhaps how it should be. Now, I also want to address, and this may come up in the question time, those of you that are kind of in the middle when you hear these conversations about introversion, extroversion, and you're not sure where you fit, you might be an ambivert, which really means just people kind of in the middle of that continuum. So with this kind of a picture for life, I love, we are at TTI, we're really still mourning the loss of Bill Bonstetter, the founder of TTI, and he and Judy Suter a number of years ago made a great statement, as far as I'm concerned, talking about the DISC assessment, but it really applies bigger than that. So they said, DISC is a neutral language, only describing the differences in how people approach problems, people, pace, and procedures. And then really this is a quotable quote, winners come from all styles of behavior. So I fully agree with Bill and Judy. And yet, when we think about this values neutral picture of maybe the way things ought to be, the next thing I think we need to add into the mix are these nasty little things called bias. So egocentric bias really is this bias that we all have to some extent that really suggests that the way things are is, or the way things ought to be is sort of the way that I am. So I'm sort of focused on the way that I'm wired, and perhaps I just impose that bias, probably without thinking, onto others around me. Secondly, to add to that egocentric bias, a lot of times there's a confirmation bias, which really points us to find evidence for the things we already think we know. And so in a sense, we kind of get trapped in this way of understanding things. And this really fits within an entire cultural bias, the way things are collectively for all of us, and these sort of myths that we tell ourselves. So this nice balanced picture we began with begins to get a bit imbalanced because the force of these biases, especially in the culture, begin to sort of push things a little bit out of whack. So this nice values neutral picture that we started with begins to get more and more skewed, and so we can really question whether this idea of values neutrality is any longer even in play. One of the ways I like to talk about this, I like to use the word myths. So I think myths really are these stories that we tell ourselves, these narratives, to kind of reinforce the things that are happening around us in the culture. And the best way to attack these myths that are causing this imbalance, I think, is by bringing truth to bear. So what I'm going to do for the next little bit here is hopefully talk to you about some common misconceptions about introversion and try to set those a little bit closer to the accurate truth as we understand things more scientifically. So this is the first myth. I'm going to talk about 6, but here's the first one. So in terms of demographics, the 2 women depicted on the screen, Catherine Briggs and Isabel Myers, are pretty heroic figures, quite frankly. Back in the 50s, followers of Carl Jung, and they really kind of were ahead of their time. These 2 women took it upon themselves to put together the original version of the MBTI personality assessment. And again, it's quite a fascinating story because neither of them was necessarily educated. So they were really advancing things and very courageous women. I think I would point out to all the women on the call that this discussion around introversion has lots of parallels with the women's movement. So these 2 ladies, in my estimation, are pretty heroic. But when they put out the first version of the MBTI in 1957, they put out a manual to talk about how to use the instrument and sort of what their thoughts were. And in that original manual in 57, they speculated, with no data behind it, that probably in the US population, about 25 to 33% of us are introverts, which really says that we're the minority. Most people, they speculated, were extroverted. And interestingly enough, with their own assessment, they found that that wasn't the case, but that false information, as often happens, sometimes it sticks nonetheless. So data from 2001 with MBTI tells us that 57% of us are introverted, and these numbers are pretty accurate, even if we fast forward to today. So the data really is showing a different story. It's saying that introverts actually are the majority. Now, we might be the silent majority, but we may well be the majority of the population, and yet there's this myth around leadership that suggests that extroversion is the ideal style of leadership. And so there's a huge disconnect between this extrovert ideal and this introverted reality. So that's one of the myths, I think, unfortunately, that we run into in the culture. Let's talk about another one. So lots of us have sort of run into this idea, or we may even think it as we're on the call today, that somehow introversion is really the same thing as shyness. I'd like to challenge that. One of the resources, I'll mention a few names as we go, but Bernardo Carducci is really the shyness expert, and so a lot of the thoughts I'm sharing with you today come from him. But in reality, shyness and introversion are not the same thing, and they can be teased out from one another. So we can plot temperament or behavioral style on one axis and shyness on the other axis, and really distinguish the 2 different constructs from each other in such a way that we have calm introverts and calm extroverts, and shy or anxious introverts and shy or anxious extroverts. Shyness really is social anxiety. It's really an over-awareness of ourselves in the moment, and that's really what makes us shy. What's interesting is when you differentiate the 2 concepts, then you're able to kind of look at this a little bit differently and realize that both introverts and extroverts, when they're calm and they don't have lots of social anxiety going on, they're pretty happy. It looks different, Introverts and extroverts certainly have a different look to them, but both are quite content, quite happy. When an introvert struggles with social anxiety or shyness, they've got a little bit of pain. This is sort of the thing from the hospital with the degrees of pain. So maybe the smile's gone, but the most painful place to be is as an extrovert struggling with social anxiety. I got a few questions after the conference in Phoenix. Several individuals said, I'm on the disc, I'm a high D, high I. In our lingo, that's extroversion. And they said, yet clearly I'm an introvert. And so they were asking me, can you help me? As I've thought about it since getting those questions, I think this may be at least part of the explanation. So they may well be extroverts struggling with social anxiety. And so because the culture equates shyness with introversion, it's kind of creating a little bit of confusion in terms of who they see themselves as. So shyness and introversion really are distinguishable. And I think that's an important thing for us to add some truth to counter the myth here. Here's a third myth. Aren't introverts sort of these reclusive, misanthropic, fringe kinds of people? Don't they struggle with antisocial behavior, things like that? This is pretty common, especially in the media. You can see on the screen Bo Bergdahl. He's actually from here in Idaho. And when he was first going through the ordeal with his troops over in Afghanistan, there was one morning I was watching the news and I heard the reporter say something like, Bo Bergdahl had become more introverted. And my wife knows I'm highly sensitive to this conversation. So she must have seen my head spin around pretty quickly and really start screaming at the television. That's really a very inaccurate way to talk about it. What I think they meant to say was that Bo had become more withdrawn from his fellow soldiers and kind of pulled himself away from people. But to use the word introvert, again, as I'm trying to explain, probably not the best use of language, but boy, does that sure fit this stereotype around these sort of introverted fringe kinds of characters in our culture. The young man on the bottom left was the shooter from the Charleston church shooting. I believe his name was Dylan Roof. And here's a couple newspaper articles or online articles that came out talking about Dylan Roof just after the shooting. And you start to see that there's really a significant problem here in our culture that's trying to paint the picture of introversion really being this antisocial aspect of people. In my estimation, that's really not what was wrong with this young man. He probably had psychological disorders and obviously had large amounts of hate in his heart, but I don't think introversion is really where we should lay the blame. But again, this isn't the first instance or the last. I continue to see this, and it's a little bit disturbing to me. I don't know how it sits with you. So introverts really aren't antisocial, but I think it's accurate to say that we're differently social. I would describe myself, in fact, as a social introvert. I love people. I just prefer them usually one-on-one or in small groups. Don't really like small talk, would rather have a deep conversation with a close friend over a glass of wine or a cup of coffee. Those are my preferred social settings. I can function in a large setting, but really this would be my preference. So this is a different way to think about introversion and being social. Here's another myth. Is introversion really something that's curable, which obviously suggests that it's something that's wrong with us? You can see the image of the DSM books that have progressed over time from this small spiral-bound one at the top here in this depiction all the way to the most recent one, the DSM-5 that came out just a year or two ago. In the midst of putting the DSM-5 together, however, there were some overtures to the committee putting that book together, suggesting that introversion be included as a facet of a number of personality disorders. And thanks to some heroic introverts who protested and wrote the committee and suggested they not do that, the DSM-5 did not include that kind of language. However, it wasn't quite as successful in the international context. In the World Health Organization's ICD language, this goes back a version to ICD-9, there are at least two disorders that are specifically connected to introversion. So you really begin to get this pretty disturbing picture that far from what Carl Jung was saying or others about introversion being a normal, healthy way to be, we start to see this myth that somehow introversion is something we should cure or eliminate within people. So I'm suggesting that that's simply not the case. Here's another myth. Introversion is just a choice. Usually the way this comes at us on the introverted side is through, maybe it's a employee review or something like that, or feedback from our colleagues, people saying things like, Andy, you need to talk more, you need to put yourself out there more, you need to contribute when we do brainstorming, things like that. It really reflects sort of a misunderstanding, and again, I don't think it's intentional, but a misunderstanding of this idea that we can simply choose who we are. Around this conversation, at least 50%, maybe a little bit more, of our traits, including introversion, are the result of heredity, and we're really clear science has progressed significantly, and we really think we know pretty clearly that that's the case. So it really is the wrong thing to suggest that we should simply choose to be somebody else rather than being the person that we really were created to be in the first place. What you find around this choice myth is that there are really sort of two operating systems. So you can see on the slide, there are two different neural pathways that introverts are using versus extroverts. Introverts are pushing a lot more data down a much longer path up through the frontal lobes of their brain, whereas extroverts cut pretty quickly to the motor area, and that's why extroverts are much better thinking on their feet and making quick decisions. But this is a neurological reality. So it's not only that the pathways, the neurotransmitters themselves, we can start to see that this is a physiological difference that exists. And so it really becomes sort of silly to talk about just choosing to be different as opposed to understanding where you fall on the spectrum and how you're wired differently and how we should better understand and work with each other. So again, it's sort of like an Apple versus a PC, which is better. I mean, we all might have a preference, but really it's just two different operating systems. I think that's important for us to take away from this today. And then all of that really combines to the sixth myth, which is really that introverts can't be leaders. You'll hear this perpetuated over and over again. I think because of the work that many have begun to do, including myself, I think we're starting to make a dent in this. But much like it was with the issue around women in leadership, which frankly has made some significant progress, but still a lot further to go, the conversation with introverts in leadership, I think, is just beginning. And I think you'll see more and more about this. So really, it's kind of a silly idea, but it does get spoken and reinforced quite often in our culture that somehow being an introvert disqualifies people from leadership. So let's talk a little bit about not only what introversion isn't, which I've described to you a little bit. Let me give you my definition of introversion. So as I've tried to boil it down, I think there's three primary parts to it. I think number one, it's a little bit slower paced, and I think we know that. And again, I'm not making a qualitative judgment about slow versus fast. It's slower, it's a little more cautious, etc. It's a little more inward oriented. It doesn't mean it's antisocial. It just means there's typically a much deeper, richer inner life. And this quality of being stimulus averse is definitely a part, as I understand it, of what introversion is. So all of those things are there in a leader that affects the way that we think, feel, and behave. So that's all introversion is. It's, again, not some ill that we need to cure, but it's really just a way of describing a part of who we are. And again, it's just a part. But if we follow the cultural stereotype around leadership, just notice with me on the screen, look at the kinds of leaders that wouldn't fit that mold. If we think that all leaders need to be these over-the-top, charismatic extroverts, it's going to leave some really important people out of the conversation. Now, some of these faces you probably know, some you may not know. The guy on the bottom right that I was going for was not Jim Caviezel. I was going for somebody that lived a lot longer ago than that. But you start to see that some of these people really have changed the world and the way that we interact in the world. Lots of the technology advances, I think, have been led certainly by introverts in leadership. So again, we need to really question these pictures that don't seem to connect with reality. So all of this conversation and looking at these myths and trying to correct them with truth has led me to think a lot about this idea of complementary strengths, that extroverts and introverts need each other, that talking needs to be complemented with listening, action does need planning, vision needs wisdom, and what about optimism and pessimism? I talk oftentimes when I'm working with groups about the strength of pessimism, and I say it for shock value because I always get a funny look back. Our culture really thinks that pessimism is just the wrong answer to the question, and then usually I throw it back at them and say, well, how many of you would like to have an optimistic engineer? I think the bridge will hold. I'm pretty hopeful about that. So you can start to see that pessimism is definitely a real strength, but if we are walking around as introverts feeling bad about maybe our propensity to see the downside in things, it really can shut down the best kinds of conversations. So complementary strengths definitely are the ticket for us to have in this conversation, and really to understand this complementarity in all of life, and really it provides the best kinds of leadership. So what I'm starting to understand is that leaders naturally are going to want to pair up. So there's almost another myth that I didn't mention thus far, but typically in our organizational thinking, at least in the US, we often think of leadership as sort of a pyramid going to the CEO, or sort of this one key leader at the top. And again, that's pretty common. But what I've noticed in lots of organizations is there's this natural pairing, so that the extroverted Steve Jobs really does need the Steve Wozniak to help him lead. We wouldn't have Apple without both of them. And obviously, if you've read the story of these two men, it's just the case. Wozniak really was, in many ways, kind of the brains of the operation, but he really needed Steve Jobs to help him take the company forward and to create those cutting-edge projects that we all use and enjoy every day. So you'll see this thing in the White House. You'll see an FDR needs an Eleanor. So you'll see this nice balance between different kinds of people on the extroverted and the introverted side of the equation. You'll see it at Google. You'll see Sergey Brin and Larry Page, and how they naturally sort of complement each other and they start grouping together. You'll see a Steve Ballmer to complement a Bill Gates at Microsoft. You'll see, this is a great one. I love this one because it's not only complementary around the introvert-extrovert conversation, it brings gender into it as well. So Sheryl Sandberg and Mark Zuckerberg naturally complement one another. And so this balance that we see in leadership is beautifully portrayed in them. And this, again, it's not a new idea. So all the way back to the founding fathers, Franklin and Jefferson, wouldn't really have the Declaration of Independence that we have, or all the rich heritage that we have in the US, without this nice mix of extroverts and introverts working together there in that famous summer in 1776. The group of them is really just about equally composed. And so one of my key takeaways, I think, from today is not only advocating for the strengths and the value of introverts, but really also advocating for the need for balance. So in this conversation, we were reminded, again, back to what Bill and Judy said, that winners are coming from all styles of behavior. So when we only think about the right kinds of leaders coming on one side of the equation, not only are we imbalanced, I think we're missing. We really cut off 50% or more of those traits that will make the best kinds of leadership. And so this idea of balance is really a key thing. One of the things that I've really enjoyed in researching it more in depth is understanding, kind of through an Eastern philosophical lens, the beauty of this tension or this balance between yin and yang that really is right at the heart of the way the world is supposed to operate. And in fact, I just really have enjoyed getting to learn even deeper and to understand that this kind of dialectical thinking is actually a higher level of thinking than either or thinking. So it's really a both and approach, and that's really what I'm advocating for today with you. What I did learn is kind of an interesting word. It looks like the third person pronoun in English, he, but I learned that in Chinese, and Cafe will kill me for this because I'm going to butcher it, but I learned that that word that describes the balance between yin and yang is pronounced huh? So I laughed when I first learned that because I realized I say that word all the time, usually to my wife when she's asking me questions. It's kind of a lazy first response to the question. But really, as I've begun to appreciate the beauty and the wisdom in this Eastern way of looking at things, that balance point, I think, is really key. So I hope that's one of the takeaways that you get from this time together today. And I hope that you start seeing these kinds of pairings all around you. They're there, I suspect, but I think noticing them and really giving them the intentionality that they deserve, I think is a great thing for all of us to do coming out of this time together today. So let me make a few closing comments as I kind of wind us down to the Q&A time. So I think it's really important that we get this, that we understand that there may well be lots of misinformation about introversion that the culture has told us, and we really need to begin to question that with more accurate scientific understanding, and so that we understand it in a way that Bill Gates here is describing from his introverted side of life. He's saying, you better learn what extroverts do. You better hire some of those and tap into both sets of skills in order to have a company that thrives both as deep thinking and building teams and going out into the world to sell those ideas. So Bill Gates obviously understood this concept from the introverted side of it, but he really valued the extroverts that he brought to bear at Microsoft to make it not only one of the most successful companies that we've ever seen, but to make Bill Gates one of the wealthiest men that exists in the world today. So getting it, I think, is a key takeaway, and I'm hoping that all of you follow me here. So the gentleman on the screen is named Bruce Klunder. Usually when I ask this live, I'll say, anybody ever heard of him? And almost no one has. So this gentleman, Bruce Klunder, you can see he's born in 1937. He was originally from Baker, Oregon, not too far from where I am speaking to you today in Boise, Idaho, so about a couple hours from here. And Bruce Klunder grew up, kind of in the wide open spaces of Baker, and he ends up going back east to go to seminary and gets married and has some young children, eventually ends up in Cleveland, Ohio, in the midst of the civil rights movement as things are really beginning to heat up in that cultural conversation or even that crisis. And so Bruce Klunder was deeply moved by the plight of the African-American community around him and really felt that it was something that he needed to insert himself into. And so he was in the midst of Cleveland on a job site for a school that was being constructed. At that time, Cleveland was building segregated schools, and Bruce Klunder and some others just found that offensive and unacceptable, and I would agree with his thought there. So unfortunately, he's on a job site protesting the construction of a school, and a bulldozer inadvertently backs over him. And so he actually becomes a martyr for the civil rights movement, one of the lesser known ones. But I think what's important about Bruce is that he's somebody who put himself on the line for the sake of others. He obviously didn't necessarily need to be there that day. He was a white male. Why is he there advocating for equality among African Americans around him? And I think in some ways it's a similar question I would throw back at some of you that may be on the call today that are on the extroverted side of life. This is really one of my favorite quotes from Ben Franklin, where he talks about justice not being served until those who are unaffected are as outraged as those who are. So my challenge, I think, to those of you on the extroverted side of this conversation is, do you understand sort of the mischaracterizations that have happened around introversion, and will you step up to the plate, kind of like Bruce Klunder did, for the sake of the introverts around you, and not only advocate for them because it's the right thing to do and it's really a just thing to do, but also, even in a selfish way, to realize that there's a definite ROI on getting this conversation and seeing the way that we work best together. So will you step up to that challenge and really help us move forward? So if you're introverted and you're part of this discussion today, my big takeaway is that there's nothing wrong with you. Who you are is a wonderful thing. You should celebrate it. You should embrace those strengths that you naturally have. If you're ambiverted, again, you should be listening to this conversation and really understanding, that you've got a little bit of each. But if you're extroverted, I think really the big takeaway is, will you step up to the plate and lead us together into this beautiful world that we can all look forward to. And I've really enjoyed so many of my colleagues around me are more on the extroverted side, and it's been just a wonderful experience to see them begin to get it more and more, and really to embrace and to begin to alter their behavior even in the way that they interact with me. It's just been a great thing that's really advanced our leadership team going forward. So that's kind of one of my hopes coming out of this webinar today. So those are my thoughts, Candace. So what I'm thinking is, should we kick it back to you?
Sure. Why don't we actually kick it back to all of the attendees as well? So
Yes.
something for action if you're listening to the webinar and you've got a burning question that you want Andy to be able to answer, you can go ahead and type your inquiry into the questions pane of the control panel of the GoToWebinar. We'll be looking through those questions that come through and serving those up to Andy to answer. And we do have one up right now, Andy, that I'd love to serve up to you if that's all right.
Great, yeah.
Great. So from Jerry Houston wants to know, one of the other biases I see is that some out there think that introverts don't communicate as well as they should. How do you speak to the misunderstanding of introverts?
So the myth is that we don't communicate as well as we ought. Yeah, I think, Jerry, I would just counter that directly. Again, we tend to be a little bit more judicious with our words. And like I was showing you on the slide with the different neural pathways, I think there's a slowness sometimes, not in terms of not being smart, but just in terms of trying to push data. I would probably take that a little bit head on and say that I think we communicate perhaps equally well, or even in some situations better. So yeah, again, I just think it's an unfortunate mischaracterization. I think there's also the potential, I mean, as I showed you with the slide on shyness, you know, there is a potential for somebody to have both introversion and shyness. And a lot of times those two things are going to get conflated together. The thing about me, honestly, I'm not really that shy, which is always interesting. When I meet people, they say, you're not an introvert. You kind of have to trust me, I am. So.
Great. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
Another question we've got coming through from Kelly Gibbons. How do you answer the question when someone asks you who makes a better leader, an introvert or an extrovert?
With it depends. So yeah, I appreciate your question, Kelly. Yeah, it's very much situational. I think one of the stories I often tell, because it makes it pretty clear, when the Titanic hits the iceberg, what kind of a leader should we have there? I think that one, I'm going to go with extroverted. So somebody who's very decisive and just really takes charge, whereas an introvert, you know, might be creating seating charts on lifeboats while the big vessel is sinking. So again, I think some of you have probably heard me say that before, but I think that's kind of a great example of why we need an extrovert when things maybe are moving faster. We're in a crisis situation, perhaps. But you can flip the scenario, and then you can really see that the case often is reversed. And so we don't need a crisis. We don't really need necessarily lots of charisma. One of the things I've actually been working on myself in the context of my dissertation, I'm desperately trying to get through, is looking a lot at transformational leadership, which is sort of an extroverted model of leadership. And there's really, you know, lots of thoughtful dialogue about the downside to that. That many have offered into that discussion. So again, it really depends, but I do want to validate both sides of the equation.
Great. Thank you for that. We have another question coming through from Arthur Miller. He said, I am a low I, and I've always found that the use of the label of pessimist to be offensive. While pessimist is the opposite of optimist, I prefer the term realist and use that in my debriefs of DISC assessments. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, Arthur, I appreciate your comment, and I bump into the same thing often. I'll usually throw out the word pessimist. I think maybe what helps them is because I'll try to own it for myself, but I'm probably experiencing similar to you that lots of people are saying, you know, no, I'm not a pessimist, I'm a realist. And again, I think it's because the cultural conversation is so skewed. I always run into it when we do job profiling, and I know there's one of the questions on the job assessment that says the need for optimism is, and I always notice everybody answers high. no matter what the job is. And so again, I think it's a cultural bias. And I guess what I would say, Arthur, to you personally is, you kind of just need to see, what fits best for you. Definitely with the low I style, which for those that don't know DISC, that's the people side of extroversion. Usually what I see more than pessimistic is probably just a little bit more reservedness or less kind of outgoing, less need for lots of people and lots of stimulation. And the pessimism, again, I usually throw it out as a maybe and see if they, how the shoes fit for them, but let them, like we do with all those reports, let them decide what fits and what doesn't. So I think it's a great comment that you're offering.
Great. From Sylvia Russell, she has a comment here, Andy, and I'm curious to see what your response is to it. She says, my understanding is that introverts get their energy more from having some quiet space and on their own rather than from people.
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that, although it's weird because not only do I read a lot and think about this stuff, I am one. So I use myself as an experiment sometimes. And for me, actually, too much alone time, I really don't like it. So again, I think we're all a little bit different. We have to put that into the equation every time. But for me, it's like I see stuff on the internet and it suggests that introverts just like to be alone all the time. And that's totally not me. I do need some alone time sometimes to think, but I really love people. So I think it is true. Part of what you're asking is this idea of different energy management systems. And so introverts, typically, it's like we have a deep cycle battery. And so we're running off of that charge. There's lots of things in that equation, sleep, different things that are restorative for us. And then we use the energy we have stored up and we sort of dissipate it over time. I'm frankly doing that right now because I'm expending energy to do this call, and I'll feel the little bit of energy drop when we're done today. Extroverts tend to be the opposite of that. So they go into a situation, whether it's a webinar or a networking event or whatever it is, and actually the stimulation around them is recharging. So I would just kind of nuance that. I know lots of people who are introverted who for them it would be true that being alone is really the main place to recharge. But I personally recharge a lot in these meaningful conversations with a close friend or with my wife or someone like that, where I'm kind of talking about deep things. And to me, that's where I get refreshed.
Great. Julia Perry has a question here, Andy, and it's specifically around the title of today's webinar. She said, your title refers to an urgent need for unconventional leaders. So does this imply that introverts are consistently being overlooked to lead? Would it be true that introverts often get analysis paralysis and make great number twos?
Well, there was a couple questions there, Julia, so let me tackle a little bit of them. Do introverts get overlooked in the leadership conversation? Unfortunately, yes. Again, when we've got this cultural stereotype running through our heads and we're trying to figure out who looks like an up-and-coming leader, we could really overlook some folks. Do some introverts, again, using the DISC model, who have more of that C dimension, do they have potentially analysis paralysis? Yes, we can be guilty of that. So, should they therefore be the number two versus the number one? Or really, should we just think about pairing them together and not be as interested in one versus two? So I think it's a great question. I think it's very insightful. And I'm not sure, I think the examples that I was talking about just a minute ago with a Zuckerberg or Gates or these introverted leaders, in fairness, their number twos are extroverts, but I'm not sure that's even the way they see that. Hopefully, it's really, really about maybe two number ones, if I was to reflect the language back that way.
Great. Thank you. We have Jose Fon asking a question here about other countries and cultures, which I think is really interesting. He says, do you have data about the percentage of introverts versus extroverts for other countries or cultures? Because he would be interested to see how they compare.
Yeah, the data's out there. I don't have it right in front of me, but yeah, it's pretty easily obtainable. You could look at it through the TTI lens. We've got lots of data from lots of countries, or you could even use MBTI or other kinds of measures. But anecdotally, we certainly know that it varies around the world. I really enjoy, recently I've had the chance to work with some students at Tuck Business School and do some coaching with them, and a lot of them are international. So I always ask, tell me about your culture. What's normative in your culture? And sometimes I'm surprised. I think I worked with a young man from Venezuela recently who was saying in his culture, it felt very much like U.S. culture. Extroversion was kind of the right answer to the question. Whereas I've talked with lots of students and individuals from the East, from China and Japan and places in India, where it's very different. So I think it is important that we frame this conversation as really I'm really addressing this within a Western context. So in the U.S. or places that are similar to that, I think the bias is stronger. Obviously, in other parts of the world, the opposite conversation might need to happen.
Mm-hmm. Great insight. Thank you. Let's, Andy, make this our final question.
Okay.
And this comes from Amanda Wong. She wants to know how could introverts use their strengths without slowing down the speed of decision making and learn faster compared to extroverts?
Well, it's hard. I mean, one of our strengths really is slowing down. It's not always valued as a strength. So I still think that, in fact, there was a recent article I just saw yesterday in Harvard Business Review about, the traits that make the best CEOs. And one of those traits, not surprisingly, was decisiveness. So I think as much as we can, that's a lot of the work I do with introverted leaders, is really being conscious about the potential to get paralyzed or to be indecisive, and to maybe try to limit, put ourselves on a leash a little bit or on a time frame, and try to leverage those good planning and thinking skills that we have, but maybe within a finite context, so that we don't fall into the trap of being indecisive. But yeah, so it's a little bit interesting, because I think part of our strength is slowing down, and so again, how do I manage that most effectively?
Great. Thank you so much, Andy. I think many of us can agree with one of your key takeaways, which is balance is key.
Yep.
And being able to see how those introverted and extroverted leaders paired up really helped it to come to life for me, and I'm sure many others
Good.
on the call.
Good.
And I think the other big takeaway that was really fantastic here is that introverts and extroverts extroverts and introverts should be able to advocate for one another to give the world stronger leaders and better organizations overall. So Andy, thank you so much for expanding your introvert energy and sharing your perspective.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, it's been great.
Yeah. Great. So for everyone on the call, as a follow-up to this presentation, we'll be sending the replay link and a survey where you can provide feedback on today's webinar. Thank you all for attending, and please stay tuned for our next public webinar. Thank you.